Good afternoon. Welcome to the first CivEx of 2021. We are so pleased to be able to offer this educational opportunity to our Flinn-Brown Fellows and for our Center for Civic Leadership partners. If you joined us for our legislative preview webinar in December, you know that the development of the state budget is the predominant work of the legislative session. And we are very fortunate to have with us our Flinn-Brown Fellow, Matt Gress, who is Budget Director for Governor Doug Ducey. On January 18th, Governor Ducey presented his budget for consideration at the legislature, and Matt will provide us a wonderful preview of that so that you all will be familiar with the topics that will likely be discussed during the legislative session. I'd like to introduce him to you. He is a former colleague, a dear friend, a wonderful fellow. As I mentioned, he is the director of the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting. He is an expert on Arizona policy, budgetary issues, and fiscal issues. Matt was appointed by the governor in 2017 to lead the state in crafting a balanced and responsible and sustainable budget that protects taxpayers and invests in essential programs. Prior to his appointment, Matt was policy advisor to Commissioner Andy Tobin at the Arizona Corporation Commission. And before that, he was a senior fiscal analyst at the Arizona Joint Legislative Budget Committee. He has taught high school in the Tulsa Public School District in Oklahoma and worked as a faculty associate at ASU. Matt is very active in the community and has served as a governing board for the Madison Elementary School District in North Central Phoenix. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Dawn, and I really do appreciate all of your work here at the Flinn Foundation and the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership. The Flinn-Brown program is very special to me. It was quite formative in my development of understanding the issues facing the state, both in the near term and the long term. And, I've always I called it in my essay, and you'll see the theme in the governor's budget presentation throughout, that the Flinn-Brown Fellow Program is Arizona's civic gymnasium, where you build those muscles that come along with citizenship and civic engagement. So, Dawn, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to the conversation. I just want to shout out to the Flinn-Brown 2015 Fellows, Chris and Stuart, for putting their welcome comments in the chat. I appreciate it. We'll have to get together soon when it's safe to do so. But we'll start off first with some polling questions. I always like to get data to figure out who's on the line. So let's take a look at the first polling question, and I think Sarah's going to pull that up. What area of the state are you joining from? Mostly urban, I see. Okay, but we do have some rural representation here. Not to rain on Stuart's parade. All right, we'll go to the next question. What sector of the workforce do you represent? All right, so a concentration, slightly more higher concentration in the nonprofit sector, but relatively equally distributed from public, private, and education. Next question, the most important to me. Do you believe the state budget impacts your daily life? Yes. Well, that is a well-informed response for all of the respondents, and hopefully for those of you who said no, I hope to, by the end of this presentation, convince you otherwise. We'll see. And the final question. What public policy area is most important to you? All right, so education and the economy were the tied for the top two, followed by health and human services, certainly an item of major importance in any given year, but certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so education, the economy, and health and human services are the top. We decided just as that is a very good observation, Linda. And for John's question, we wanted to parse out public sector agencies, public municipalities, for instance, versus educational institutions, if that makes sense. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. And the arrangement of this is going to, and hopefully we're going to touch on a number of these topics: education, the economy, health and welfare, to be sure. But how we were going to do this presentation is to try to get through the slides so that if there's a question you have, maybe the slides answer it, maybe it prompts another question, and then try to provide as much time for Q&A as possible. So I will go ahead and share my screen. And are we good to go on that front?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So let's jump in. The year 2020 began with the Arizona Way on full display. We led the nation in terms of poverty reduction, with over 175,000 Arizonans pulling themselves out of poverty. We were second in job growth, with more jobs than people to fill them. We were fourth in weekly wage growth, sixth in export growth. And then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, bringing with it unprecedented loss and economic hardship. That shock was followed by a steady rebound that we'll talk about today. And the 2022 executive budget addresses the immediate issues of concern, health and education, following the aftermath and the current state of the COVID, to investments that reflect the compassion, the innovation, and resilience of the people we serve. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll talk about the economy and the state revenue, both from a national level and also a state level. Then give you an overview of the budget, where the executive budget would prioritize spending, and then hit key priorities, following up with kind of an update on the fiscal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, especially highlighting the federal investments, the massive amounts of federal investments that have come into the state. So unprecedented is the word of this recession. And you can see the solid blue lines represent real GDP growth, or the value of our economy, and the percentage change. And you can see in Q2 of last year, we saw nearly a 31% drop in GDP, followed by a 33% increase in GDP. And for perspective, the average is around 2.4, 2.5%. That's the usual. So you can see how odd this type of economic shock was, along with its recovery. Now, the gold bar represents the nominal value, the dollar value of our economy. And we're on track once the Q4 for calendar year 2020 numbers are finalized. We're on track to meeting the same level of value of our economy that we were in 2019. So basically, flat year for 2020 due to the whipsaw of the pandemic. Looking at the pandemic from a jobs perspective, it's stark. You can see the solid bars represent the total number of jobs. In March of 2020 versus April of 2020, we saw over a 20 million job loss. Now, for perspective, just 1 month, 20 million, about 22, 23 million jobs were lost. In February, we had gained 23 million jobs over the last decade. So it took a decade to get to 23 million jobs following the Great Recession. And in 1 month, that number of jobs vanished. It was quite stark. Now we have picked up steam, but we're still below where we were before the pandemic. Now the gold bar represents unemployment rate, and you can kind of see the same story here. It was low, elevated to historic highs, and has recovered, but is still elevated compared to before the pandemic. Arizona, however, outperformed the US. The left-hand side shows the percentage change in jobs. We lost around 9% of our jobs in April. That was the big month where we took a hit. The US close to 14%. Arizona placed in the top 5 of states who lost the fewest number of jobs in the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the 2 bars on the right show the employment recovery, employment as a level of pre-COVID-19 levels, where we are right now. We've regained nearly 97% of the jobs that we had before the pandemic, whereas the US is around 93%. Now, that has had a positive impact on our economy. We're up over $900 million 21 budget, or about 15%. And you can see that it's largely focused in the individual income tax sector and the transaction privilege tax, which is our sales tax. But we're doing really well in those 2 sectors, and it aligns with, you can see both the JLBC baseline, which is the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. It is our legislative budget office. It does forecasting in concert with the executive, and you can see both forecasts, the actuals as well as the individual income tax, or the JLBC baseline, are above the enacted 21 projections. So the executive, in fact, has raised their revenues. We're projecting upwards of $1.3 billion roughly of additional revenues than we anticipated in 21, current fiscal year, 724 million in 22, 500 million in 23, and then 13 billion in total revenues in 24. And the growth rates at the bottom can give you a sense of the magnitude. And 21, we're halfway through fiscal year 21. It runs July 1 to June 30th. So we feel pretty confident about 13.2% growth rate, even though it is significantly above the 10-year average, whereas all of our other growth rates in the out years are below it. Now that gives you a sense of the box. We kind of create how much revenue is available to figure out what we need to spend on baseline initiatives, which I'll talk about in a second, or executive initiatives. But before I get there, I just wanted to make one other comparison here, and this is more technical in part, but it shows that the big news to take out of this is how what the delta is between JLBC and our office, the executive office. We are, and just to reference, I mentioned the 13.8%. We're halfway through the fiscal year in terms of revenues, so we feel pretty confident about meeting that target. Year to date, we're 17.8%. So we're doing really well right now with revenues. But over that 4-year period, we have a difference of just $186 million with JLBC, which we think is pretty good. Now, that's pre-tax reform. We do tax reform, and then we're about $1 billion below JLBC's estimates. Just for perspective, we're talking about $186 million, out of an annual budget in excess of $12 billion. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And this gives you another aspect of that, where the executive $65 million above JLBC in 22, $195 million in 23, $106 million in 24. And here's the historical difference of the executive versus JLBC. And you can see that the cumulative gap has shrunk over time. It has you see an uptick here where we're actually above the legislature, but we're kind of really in a pretty good spot versus being too out of bounds, we think. All right, so the first major initiative that we're proposing to do is tax reform. We think that, one of the key ingredients to really propelling Arizona's economy forward is ensuring that Arizona individuals and small businesses have more money themselves to invest in their businesses and their families and their futures. We think that will help propel Arizona's recovery forward. And we can do that without sacrificing investments in critical areas, as I'll talk about in just a second. So our tax reform has two parts: tax conformity with the Federal CARES Act. Last year it passed in March, and it included temporary tax provisions that states can conform or partially conform or not conform at all. And we are proposing partial conformity with most of the individual changes in the CARES Act. These include deduction for charitable expenses, HSA usage for prescription drugs, business interest deductions. So that will cost $44 million in year one and $29 million in year two. These are temporary, so they'll go away. These are one-time tax changes. What we're focused more so on is the permanent income tax reform. We want income tax reform for all Arizonans, as many Arizonans as possible. The governor ran on this in 2014 and again in 2018, that he wants to lower the individual income tax rate to as close to zero as possible. And this is an opportunity where we have a need for recovery. We have the cash to do it, and it would greatly benefit Arizonans in making our state a competitive place to stay and a competitive place for millions to move here, either to live, work, recreate, retire, start a business, or get an education. So our tax plan, permanent tax reform, will be $200 million ongoing in 2022, $400 million, a total of $400 million in 2023, and $600 million in 2024. So it would be a ramp up to have an ongoing annual tax reduction of $600 million in 24 and beyond. Now on the spending side, we're proposing $12.6 billion in spending. It's the largest dollar amount that we've spent in state history that we've proposed. And we can do tax reform, meaningful tax reform, to stimulate the economy and keep Arizona competitive. And we can also invest in the things that matter. And I'll talk about that in a second. The rainy day fund, it's called the Budget Stabilization Fund, but it's our fund to stabilize state budgets when we see revenue failures. Now, we used the rainy day fund for one-time public health emergency expenses when the legislature was in session last year. 15 other states, though, we estimate, used the rainy day fund to actually balance their budget. We did not have to do that, which I think is a blessing. And you can see the existing balance is 8.1% of total general fund revenue. That's where our current balance is. It's a way to gauge how much, what's the value of this rainy day fund relative to how much money you typically take in. And you can see that the median across all the other states is about 8.4%. So we're in the vicinity of where most states are right now. And that's due in large part to policy decisions we made in keeping the economy open and running and having essential services in action, and federal stimulus. A lot of federal stimulus came in, which we'll talk about later. So we get a sense of where the economy is going, where the revenues are, what is available for us to allocate. We've done some tax reform options. We have strong fiscal reserves. And so now we shift to the budget priorities. Now, this is kind of how the budget gets built. So we start with the box of the red box, assuming no new spending, keeping 21 as the baseline, and assuming the new revenues coming into the state. There's $2 billion that we estimate will be in the state general fund at the end of fiscal year 22, this upcoming fiscal year. We included $230 million in tax reform, and then we looked at the spending side of the equation. $580 million in executive baseline changes. These are three major components: education, healthcare, and public safety, backfilling the public safety fee, the $32 registration fee that supported the highway patrol. Those are the three main components. The executive initiatives, which I'll talk about in this presentation, $290 million, smaller than the executive baseline changes. But our interest is not overcommitting, not overpromising, and reserving some of the capacity for tax reform. That leaves us with an ending balance of $923 million. It's pretty high by standards. Typically, we are around $200 million, usually $100 to $200 million. But these are unprecedented times, and having an ending balance like that helps buffer, we think, uncertainty that could emerge. Spending at a glance, the left-hand side is the executive initiative piece, equally distributed amongst categories. The executive baseline and initiatives, most of it's going to K-12, higher ed, and health and welfare, which is primarily in the Medicaid agency. So we maintain positive structural and cash balances, and structural balance means ongoing revenues minus ongoing spending. You want that to be a positive number, otherwise you're running a deficit. We maintain that in all of our 3 years. Now, you can see the numbers are relatively narrow in 23 and 24, but as my mentor, Richard Stavniak, who's the director of the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, has said, the budget is out of date the day after it's passed. And so this is a forecast, and the 2 years that you want to pay close attention to are 21 and 22, which we're pretty good in. All right, so let's shift to education. The formula funding is a big topic at the Capitol right now. Our state funding formula pays schools based on the number of students attending. That number is down significantly. Average daily membership is down year over year. We estimate, based on fall data, about 37,000 kids. And as a result, the funding formula is projected to pay out $389 million less than what we budgeted for. So that is going to be a direct impact to schools. Now, there are corresponding offsetting monies coming into the schools at the same time. But the first piece is that we're taking the formula savings here and putting it back into the schools as part of the student-focused acceleration and support, which I'll talk about in a second. But on top of that, you have state-directed federal money as part of the CARES Act. The governor received $1.86 billion to invest in COVID-19 related costs. We've given some to locals. That was a big chunk. We've provided a lot to public health, public safety, personnel salaries to support critical work during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also allocated $370 million of the coronavirus relief funds to the to schools to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. But the feds also included other money. In the latest bill that was signed by President Trump in December, included $1.2 billion in direct pass-through federal aid to schools in Arizona. And that's in addition to the $277 million that schools received from the CARES Act, directly passed through to them. All in, we're looking at $2.2 billion in strategic funding in just this fiscal year in 2020, in 2021. When you look at it on a per pupil basis, or even adjusted for inflation, this is the largest dollar amount we are spending on a per pupil basis, largest dollar amount in state history. So schools are in a very strong financial position this year. So I want to chat about the supplemental appropriation that we've included for our summer targeted program called Student Focused Acceleration and Support. It's a grant program for high impact intervention and programming to mitigate the learning loss that has stemmed from the COVID-19 pandemic. So of the 389, 298 million would be going for all grades. And we are allocating that based on the estimated students on the free and reduced lunch program as an element of need. That equates to about $500 per pupil. And the expectation is 50 hours of instruction during the summer. It has to be in person. There needs to be a usage of one-on-one and small group instruction. If parents would like a distance learning option, that has to be available as well. But that's the general contours. But then we're providing another 91 for 3 critical grade bands. Those students who are currently in kindergarten through 3rd grade, current 8th graders, current 11th graders. We know that those 3 critical grade bands are especially important. 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, graduating on time are the 3 key determinants to success after high school. We want to make sure that that happens. So we're providing an additional funding amount of $327 per pupil based on our estimate here. And that would contemplate 80 hours of instructional time for those students. Shifting gears to new investments in K-12. $268 million, of course, enrollment and inflation growth. But on top of that, we have additional assistance restoration. This is completing a $1 billion promise that we made back in 2019 that included the 20% pay raise for teachers by 2020. And that also included the full restoration of a key part of our state funding formula, additional assistance, which funds, it funds soft capital like technology, textbooks, personnel salaries. It supports other capital, building renewal at school sites. So it's a very important funding source and flexible funding source for schools. And we're doing that a year ahead of schedule, actually. We've accelerated it 2 years in a row. So we've been able to finalize this commitment this year. And then there are some other items here that we'll talk about. Driving Equity is a transportation solution grant program. We know that transportation is one of the most challenging barriers for parents when they're considering a school for their kids. We want to take that away. We're going to offer innovative grants this upcoming year to identify high impact, high efficiency ways of getting kids to school. We've said that a choice isn't really a choice if you have no place to get there. And then in 2023, we'll evaluate what worked and then make investments in those programs that show real promise in addressing the transportation grant. We're also including $500,000 to talk about school choice and open enrollment. We have companion legislation right now in the legislature to make all schools offer open enrollment in the same month so that parents aren't trying to figure out which schedule, which enrollment deadline. There's a common understanding. Here's when everybody's enrolling. Here's where to sign up to maximize options and reduce barriers for families. Early literacy is another important priority of the governor. Just in 2015, only 40% of 3rd graders passed the English language arts exam. Now that's up to 46% as of our recent data in 2019, but there's still much more work to be done. So we're deploying literacy coaches at high need schools. We are starting a statewide entry evaluation for kindergartners to identify literacy gaps early on. Before they get to 3rd grade, we can provide the attention that they need. Funding to hire literacy specialists, especially those who are experts in dyslexia. This is a responsive to the superintendent's request to help in that area. And then $1 million to fully fund the foundations of reading evaluation for all new teachers so that all of our new teachers understand literacy, its importance, how to identify gaps and how to remediate those gaps and how to connect the resources together. Other educational innovation, $3 million to increase access to the Expansion Innovation Fund. We use some of this funding with our CARES Act education money. 20,000 students to date have received really creative and innovative options to learn amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to keep that innovation going. And then the Personalized Learning Network. This is affiliated with the Center for the Future of Arizona to teach teachers how to engage in meaningful, differentiated instruction, because every learner is at a different stage in their learning journey, and we need to be able to be responsive to that. And this will move the ball in terms of professional development. Strengthening Arizona's civic muscles. I got that from the Flinn-Brown was an inspiration there. But $2 million to build up this program. It's been incredibly important to the governor. The first bill he signed was the American Civics Act to require citizenship test passage in order to obtain an Arizona high school diploma in 2015. But we're going to establish the Civics Innovation Fund grant program, again, to inspire and create really engaging ideas to talk about civics in a relevant way to high school students. We also want to establish the AZ Civics Core Pilot to provide $1,000 per semester for high school juniors and seniors who engage in civic civic life and civic service communities. We're also providing these two programs are helping more kids access advanced placement tests so that they can earn college credit for a fraction of the cost, waiving the fee for low-income students, and also providing more incentives for schools to hire more AP teachers and offer more slots, more classroom space for these because these are grant programs. We're also funding adult education, which is the state match to draw down federal funds for reskilling Arizona's workforce. Ensuring opportunity for all the Jobs for Arizona graduates that works with disconnected or at-risk youth to keep them in school, keep them on track. We're going to increase our investment there. And the alternative teacher development program via the Teach for America, we want to double our investment there to build out the pipeline further of passionate, engaged, and teachers in high need areas. And they stay in the classroom, 93% retention. School Facilities Board, this is our state agency that handles school capital for district schools. If they need a building replaced, if they need a new school because of their student population, this agency funds that. And that's building renewal, roofs, HVACs, chillers, et cetera. These are issues that are grants that schools ask for, and we're fully funding that. And you can kind of see the uptick over the course of a year. And each line in fiscal year 19, fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21 year to date, the costs keep on going up, and we're maintaining our commitment to that program, both in fiscal year 21 and in 22. $70 million to build 7 new schools, which we're really excited about. And again, this is another policy issue where we're building schools. We're building them ahead of schedule and before kids show up. That was a big policy change of the executive a few years ago, where instead of schools being built 2 years after the kids have shown up and you were at capacity, we're doing that before. On the higher education front, $174 million. Of that amount, $115 million came from the governor's discretionary coronavirus relief funds of that $1.86 billion that I talked about earlier, but to go to the 3 universities for COVID-specific needs. $35 million, the new economy operational funding, which I'll talk about. Teachers Academy, $21 million, and then some community college funding as well. For the new economy, our universities had to be stabilized, and they received direct aid from the Federal CARES Act and the recent COVID relief bill passed in December, discretionary money from the governor, and then we're providing additional funding in the state budget to help them focus on the new economy. These are degrees that reflect the growing workforce sectors in Arizona, thinking about coding, artificial intelligence, the concept of entrepreneurship, and building out small businesses, which is a major driver of the Arizona economy, among healthcare and engineering. So we're funding that. The Teachers Academy is a huge success story, and it's a signature program of the governor. Just in a few years ago, we only had 250 kids enrolled in the Teachers Academy. I should say students enrolled in the Teachers Academy. And the idea behind this academy is that for every year that you agree to teach in a public high school, after you leave the academy, we'll pay for your tuition so you can graduate debt-free. It's one of those ways of expanding the pipeline of teachers into Arizona schools. Compensation is one way, but on the front end of making this enticing to come into the profession, if at least only for a few years, to share your passion about your subject area with kids, is a big deal. We're up to 3,000 kids, 3,000 students now who are in the Arizona Teachers Academy, and you can see the breakdown among the universities. Shifting to health and welfare, $600 million we've spent year to date on our response to COVID-19 from a variety of funding sources. And the three top areas: testing and tracing, PPE and equipment, and staffing, staff augmentation at hospitals, nurses, doctors, etc. And you can see some of these other things. And there's a federal grant that was direct pass-throughs, CRF, that was the governor's $1.86 billion in discretionary funds. Express Pay is an innovative program we started to leverage FEMA emergency money. And then PHAF is the Public Health Emergency Fund, which was that state funded response that we used the rainy day fund monies on. Some other areas in the health and welfare sector, we're expanding the long-term care surveyor team at the Department of Health Services to decrease the caseload for investigating complaints at long-term care facilities and resolving them more quickly. We'll decrease that caseload from 108 to 45 per surveyor. We're expanding the Child Care and Development Fund. This is the fund that pays out child care subsidies to working families. This is a major workforce issue here, to keep working parents on the job and to know that their children are being safely taken care of. So we're $18 million to continue the suspension of the child care wait list, and we're creating a new program, a pilot program that provides child care subsidies to qualifying parents who are pursuing degrees in education or nursing. And then there's a supplemental need that we to reflect some of the stabilization efforts that we did for the child care infrastructure back in the summer and fall. Adult Protective Services, this is a division of the Department of Economic Security that investigates cases of neglect or abuse of vulnerable adults, seniors, individuals with developmental disabilities, among others. We want to bring that caseload ratio down to 1 to 25, which is the industry standard, again, to help facilitate investigations and resolution of cases of abuse or neglect. And we're including provider rate increases for the adult and aging area services, the AAAs. These, think of Meals on Wheels and other programs and supports to help keep vulnerable adults independent for as long as possible. Family First Prevention Services Act, this was related to the Department of Child Safety. The feds, up until 2022, would reimburse the state for placements of kids in DCS care at congregate settings, group homes. The average stay is about 30 days. But the new federal law says, hey, DCS, you need to get these kids placed in a family-like setting as quickly as possible. We're only going to reimburse you for 14 days. After that, the cost is on you. Well, we have to transition into that. We want to do it in a safe way through either prevention to address issues before they arise and need to result in the removal of children from the home, or also just building the pipeline of the network for kinship families and other foster families that we can put a family-like setting as quickly as possible. We're integrating healthcare, behavioral and physical healthcare for children in DCS care, which is a really big deal. This is 3 years running. We're providing $6 million for opioid treatment. This is a continuation of a really bipartisan, passed unanimously out of the legislature in 2018, the Opioid Epidemic Act. And in that, there was a bipartisan effort led by the Democrats to put $10 million into a fund to provide opioid treatment services to uninsured or underinsured Arizonans. We've served over 33,000 since that time. Funding is depleted. We want to put in $6 million to continue those services. On the public safety side, for corrections, we have about $54 million worth of, $80 million worth of corrections investments. Most of it's going to capital. I'll talk about right now. $54 million for capital to fund building renewal, which will be the first time we've fully funded building renewal for ADCRR since the inception of the building renewal formula. And we're including $25 million for specific capital projects at IMAN. Exit survey data shows that workplace safety concerns are actually cause for 26% of those leaving, is cause for them leaving, essentially. We're also increasing funding, $18 million for bed management. This entails the deactivation of the Florence facility so that we can move inmates into for bed management purposes, either into public or private facilities, and we can move all the staff at Florence down the street to IMAN. Those two facilities have some of the highest vacancy rates, and when you have high vacancy rates, you can't properly secure the facilities in the way that you want. Staff safety is a concern, inmate safety is a concern, and recidivism reduction programs that you have to be able to secure the inmates in order for those programs to occur. So this will really free up resources to do that. And this is a 1908 facility at Florence. It's very old, it's past its prime, and this is an opportunity to deactivate that prison. But we also want to reduce recidivism. That's the primary goal of all of this, is a second chance, a meaningful second chance. And one of those ways that we do that is through rehabilitation. That's why that's the new name of the Department of Corrections Rehabilitation and Reentry, ADCRR. Well, rehabilitation occurs through many programs, including substance abuse treatment. Right now, only 13% of eligible inmates can get access to treatment. 87% go untreated. Our proposal would bring that up to 36% by working with outside contracted providers. We know it works. Of those who get treatment, only 36% have been studied to recidivate, whereas for the control group or the non-treatment group, 52%, over half, recidivate without getting that substance abuse treatment. We're including $14 million for body cams to ensure safety, efficiency, and transparency at DPS. We're providing more funding for overtime. There's a shortage right now. So staff troopers often work their 40 hours within a 3 or 4 day period. And then on their 5th day of work, they've adjusted out. They're not on duty. And that has created some staffing concerns for us. And we also want to recruit, expand our recruitment efforts so that we can fill trooper slots and address the need to ensure we have a sustainable force. We're investing over $50 million in radio infrastructure in northern Arizona. Law enforcement agencies, tribal, local, federal, and the state need radios, and there's a lack of connectivity in rural Arizona that we're going to address. From a natural resources perspective, wildfires take the center stage, and that is tied to, and you can see these black areas here. These black marks are where the wildfires occurred, and they've understandably occurred in areas that have high and extreme hazards. So a couple of ways that we need to respond to this. First of all, the fires are going to still happen, and we need to respond to them. We need to increase funding to fight our fires. We owe the federal government some money for cost share of fires, and we're proposing to increase the governor's emergency fund to handle the increased fire costs, as well as the overall operating budget for the Department of Forestry and Fire Management to reflect actual needs. But the other piece is called the Arizona Healthy Forest Initiative, and there are 3 pillars. And these 3 pillars are founded on the principle of prevention, fire mitigation. We're going to continue to spend more and more and more money on fires until we start addressing some of the root causes: hazardous vegetation, forest thinning, controlled burns, etc. But the private market is somewhat constricted in this regard. We have a lot of acres we need to treat. So what we're proposing to do is the formation of the Arizona Healthy Forest Alliance, bringing in 720 low-risk inmates, training them of how to do wildland treatment, and then deploying them throughout the state to conduct treatment in those high hazard areas for wildfires. In addition, the second pillar is more grant funding to partnerships. So the private sector, especially the private sector that can do sophisticated hazardous vegetation treatment on steep grades in very remote areas, we'll be able to kind of open up that opportunity further. And then pillar 3 is innovation in our partnerships with the feds and the locals, continuing to work that out. All told, our proposal will bring the number of acres treated from 4,000 to 20,000 over a 2-year period. That's our goal. We're fully funding our state Superfund cleanup program. It's called the Water Quality Assurance Revolving Fund program. It's a state EPA Superfund program. This will be the second time since 2007 that we've fully funded it, and we want to do that on a permanent basis to clean up our water. 173 million in total capital funding among a variety of projects. The Department of Transportation, 64 million for Interstate 17. This is year 2 and a 3-year plan to add 2 new lanes between Anthem and Sunset Point on I-17 to help address congestion. We talked about corrections capital funding, 33 million for Department of Administration. I'll talk about the building renewal piece, very exciting in terms of space consolidation, thinking about hybrid work. Game and Fish for building renewal and hatcheries, the State Fair for the Coliseum repair, and other agencies. Arizona's connected workforce, you can see this chart is amazing. In February of last year, we had about 2,000 employees working at least one day remotely. That's now over 18,000 based at the end of the calendar year. Massive amounts of people are working more remotely. And we want to see how we can sustain that. We can consolidate space, and we can create more hybrid work models, kind of like the WeWork type of facility where you have sharing and hoteling, they call it. And so this will help establish that program. And then we're going to use internal savings at agencies for getting out of expensive leases to help sustain that moving forward. The Business One Stop is the place where you can go to work with the Corporation Commission, Secretary of State, Department of Revenue, all in one place at the tip of your finger. You enter your information once, and it goes out into the system, and the various agencies can process that versus paperwork and different forms and going to the agency and waiting on times and sequencing all of that out. This is going to streamline that with the Business One Stop. Connecting Arizona, we've included $40 million from the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund to put in broadband between Anthem and Flagstaff, Tucson and Nogales. We want to continue that work by installing broadband from Flagstaff to Lake Havasu with another $33 million in this executive budget. Rural broadband grants, Ben Blink, a Flinn-Brown alumnus, was heavily involved in that. $10 million to recapitalize that program. We had $3 million in 2020. Now, shifting gears very quickly, the fiscal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see in 2020, Arizona received $35 billion in federal fund. Paycheck protection and eligibility programs such as unemployment insurance, SNAP, this is our food stamp program, and then WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. It's a program based on need, a similar food program. Those are the 2 major blocks, followed by the individual impactments. But there was a big chunk, the COVID-19, the Coronavirus Relief Fund that I've mentioned earlier. Arizona total received $2.86 billion, 5 political subdivisions, populations in excess of 500,000. Phoenix, Tucson, Mesa, as well as Maricopa County and Pima County received their own specific allocation of the $2.86 billion, leaving the governor with that $1.86 billion. We've allocated most of that money to various programs, and we're reserving the remainder for the solvency of the UI Trust Fund, which I'll talk about. Claims are down, still elevated above Great Recession peaks. Initial claims are down, but that's something we'll continue to monitor. Continued unemployment claims are down below the Great Recession levels, as evidenced by that dashed blue line, but they're flattening out. And so, how much more recovery are we going to see, and how much will we need to support here? Our plan is to make sure it doesn't go below 0 so that we can pay out benefits. The gold line shows DES's projections, absent any of the governor's coronavirus relief funds. The blue line shows that we keep it around $50 million in a rolling 3-week period, which is about the amount of time, 3 weeks worth of benefits. But we keep that balance stable. The state included $50 million for crisis contingency and safety net fund, small business, landlords and rental assistance, and food assistance. The Safe Outside Dining program that we just announced another $1 million for this week is very popular and helping restaurants deal with the new norm of eating outside and making sure that there's a lot of fresh air around. Now, coming up, President Trump signed a bill at the end of December. We expect that to bring in another $11.5 billion in COVID relief over the course of this year. Paycheck protection and the direct checks to individuals are going to take the cake, but K-12 is a big chunk of money that I mentioned earlier that will help. So we maintain fiscal discipline. We assume $13.78 billion in revenues. With our tax reform package, it brings our adjusted revenues down to $13.5 billion. With a spending plan of $12.6 billion, we still are left with a healthy ending cash balance in 22 and a positive structural balance. You know, that if 2020 was the year of the virus, then 2021 will be the year of the vaccine. And its distribution and administration is the top priority of this state, because the vaccine is our way out it's a transition from being resilient to having recovered into a more prosperous, hopeful, normal future. So we're in full support of that, and that will really determine, where our state will be heading in the next 6 months and 12 months. I want to thank my staff. I have to always give them a shout out. I know we have some OSPB alumni on the call. There's a lot of work that goes into this, and it couldn't be possible without them. The amazing public servants who evaluate so many documents and so much data. The budget's available at azgovernor.gov or azospb.gov. And with that concludes my presentation.
Well, thanks, Matt. And as you can imagine, you have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and they're from our wonderful fellows who are always naturally curious and want to understand this process better. For those of you on the line, we'll continue to go through these questions. Matt's agreed to go through them until they're completed. You can stay on, or you can leave at 3 o'clock when the webinar was scheduled to end, but we're gonna get through these questions. Matt, the very first question is from All in Education, our fellow Stephanie Para, who is asking, why would we permanently reduce the state's revenues during a global pandemic while many families are in need of social services?
We look at it in a multi-pronged way, that we think that ensuring taxpayers, individuals and businesses have more money to invest in themselves, in whether it's rent, whether it's buying property, whether it is hiring employees. We think that is one key driver of economic development, economic growth. There's another side of the money we pay to government for services that can help those who are in need. We think we can do both. We have a historic spending plan that I mentioned earlier that we're focusing on. We have $35 billion of federal cash that's coming through, another $11 billion coming through this year. We think it's a multi-pronged approach that can help really put our economy in overdrive.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, why do you look at tax reform before spending? It seems like you would look at spending levels first and see then what is available for tax reform. Kind of goes hand in hand with the previous question.
Well, certainly there's an iterative process. I think this is a key distinction, perhaps, between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are inclined to support tax relief when it's warranted and when we can, when it's available, when we're not running shortfalls. We think it's better to give that money back to the taxpayers, that essentially we've collected too much in essence. But it's an iterative process, because we look at the spending plan, we look at baseline spending, we're fully funding our Medicaid commitments, we're fully funding our educational commitments. There are some executive initiatives that we want to invest in, and we are, but it goes back and forth, because sometimes we might again, they go hand in hand, tax reform and government spending. But maybe the tax reform package can't be as high as we wanted it to because of some of these spending priorities, if that makes sense, based on the available amount of revenue. But it's an iterative process that we go back and forth on to kind of calibrate the agenda as appropriate, to have cash, to have balance in the budget.
Thanks, Matt. Our next question from Michelle is, I'd love to hear more details about the $23 million in school capital needs and new K-12 investments. I imagine that's the school facilities board investments in building renewal and new school construction.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's the net increase year over year of where we are when we include the supplemental funding as well. But essentially, we're spending $120 million in building renewal grants this year. Compare that to 4 years ago, we were just at about 33 million. So we have ramped up spending on that significantly in order to meet the needs of grants coming in from school districts. So that's what that school capital program, the building renewal grant program, is what school districts use to get funding, capital funding for their schools to make improvements to or replace roofs or HVAC systems, other structures in place that have fire systems, etc.
Great, thank you. We have a question from an attendee. They are curious if items like the driving equity grants are available to tribal communities.
So these would be available to district and charter public schools. So if there's a district or charter school in a tribal community, we encourage them to apply. And we expect a lot of rural places could benefit from this, definitely, in terms of moving kids around based on just the distance. But we also look at the rural solution in other ways as well, through broadband and telemedicine, really helping these remote communities still get access to quality services that I think maybe some of our urban folks may take for granted.
Great. Our next question is from our 2020 fellow, Adelaida Severson, and she wants you to elaborate a little bit more on why we've had enrollment decreases in our public schools and what those are, what that can be attributed to.
So I think that there are two components. One is that kids are just not showing up, and from that perspective, and that accounts for about 75%. We estimate 75% of the formula savings, or just kids have disappeared, and it's a third of the students that we estimate have disappeared are in K through 3, because most schools are only providing distance learning, that virtual option, which all of us, I think, know, especially those who have younger kids, know that putting a kindergartner in front of a computer is just not a workable solution. So I think a lot of parents have decided either they can teach the kids themselves, or that it's just not worth putting them in a school, but they'll just send them to childcare instead. But there were some other anecdotes that superintendents gave, that kids have disappeared because families have moved, especially families, lower income families, who may have been unable to maintain their residence, and then they're moving in with family either somewhere in the state or somewhere outside the state. There have been certainly private school options have offered in-person schooling. ESAs, we've seen an increase. These are the empowerment scholarship accounts for homeschooling or private schooling. We've seen participation in that increase. So I think those are some of the drivers as well. Great.
We're going to go to Bill Ring. He fellow from Northern Arizona. He thanks you for your presentation, and he says that projections look mildly positive. However, in the rural setting, he is stating that his folks are singing the blues of a strong recession, and I think he's asking you to kind of reconcile what may be happening at the state level versus what's happening at the local level?
The rurals have always have had a more difficult time, and we think we're trying to mitigate that in a couple of ways. Broadband connectivity is a big one. Businesses have a hard time relocating and having supply chain issues and being connected to their organizations throughout the country or throughout the world if broadband is spotty. So creating that as a foundational tool for businesses to thrive in rural Arizona is going to be key. In northern Arizona in particular, there's a big hit in the Flagstaff area, as we know, from tourism. Has taken a big hit from the COVID-19 pandemic. People aren't traveling. So the tourism, leisure, and hospitality industry has been hit really hard in Coconino County in particular. And the universities have undergone severe cutbacks. Either kids aren't at the school, they're doing it remotely, or enrollment's down. And that was one of the factors that went into evaluating our need to help stabilize university budgets in December. But you're right. The rules are having a more difficult time at recovery. And that's one of the reasons why we provided direct allocations to our local cities and towns and counties. But that's something that's going to be, top of mind as we look ahead to a recovery.
Great. Matt, our next question is from our fellow Paul Brierly in Yuma. And he would like you to talk about the impact of Prop 208 on the budget and, just overall to the education system.
So 208, for those of you who don't know, is an income tax surcharge, or it's a surcharge on income for individuals making $250,000 or more and joint couples making $500,000 or more, on top of the top marginal tax rate, bringing the top effective top tax rate to 8%. And the money is very specific in how it's distributed. There's a formula, but the idea is that most of the money is supposed to go to raise wages for teachers. It's currently in litigation right now, and we will see what happens. If it were upheld and according to plan, we would start collecting the revenues next spring because it starts for tax year 2021. And then the first distribution would go out in the summer. Each June and December, any money in this special fund created by Prop 208 it then gets distributed to the various beneficiaries. The challenge with this is the number of payors, taxpayers in that category affected by the surcharge is relatively small. And they already shoulder roughly 47% of the individual income tax burden. That's our estimate. This would certainly boost that. Over half of the taxes are being paid by approximately 7% of the taxpayers on the individual income tax front. This is problematic because we go from one of the lowest taxing states in I guess the top 10 as we would say it, top 10 of the best tax states, or I guess we would say the bottom 10 of tax states, to the other side of the spectrum where we would have the ninth highest tax rate in the country and certainly very anti-competitive compared to nearby states. We're concerned about the sophistication of these taxpayers and their ability to move money around and move their domicile as necessary to evade or avoid paying the surcharge, which has other underlying effects because they're already contributing 47% of the underlying individual income tax revenue. And that is going to be in jeopardy as well if they decide to move their income to other states that may not have a tax on income or may have a lower income tax. So that's very problematic, I think, from a planning perspective. Now, as a former school board member, you have to budget on an annual basis. And I can tell you that that segment, when you start to target a very small group of sophisticated taxpayers who can have very different years. 1 year could be really good for them, 1 year could be really bad. It's a lot like the corporate income tax. And the corporate income tax is incredibly volatile. So the effect of what 208 will have on school budgets is they might give a pay raise in 1 year, but the monies may not show up in the next year because incomes fluctuate, people move in and out. And I think that that's going to create some difficulty in teachers being reliant upon those 208 revenues, where their pay will fluctuate and it will go up and down, versus the ancillary to that is Prop 301 and the sales tax and the classroom site fund. Sales tax is a very stable revenue, and you can kind of count on that each year, and that's how on school their budgets, they need certainty on which to do that. So I think that's pretty much my take on that. There are a lot of concerns that we have with 208 that may create challenges for the state as a whole and schools in particular.
Thanks, Matt. So we have a few questions. We have a lot of questions, but I noticed some of our fellows posted questions in the chat as well. So I'm going to go pick up a couple of those so that everybody has a fair chance to grill you. I'm going to start with an easy one. Our fellow Mignon Hollis in Cochise County wants to know when you're going to expand broadband down there.
So we think that two things. First, make sure you apply for the Rural Arizona Broadband Grant. And to a previous speaker, we carve out programs for the rural areas in particular for this. Although if you've been following the legislature, there are many urban legislators who say, hey, this broadband connectivity gap is not just a rural problem, it's an urban problem. And they're right. And there's a matter of discussion right now at the legislature. But the Rural Broadband Grant Program is going to be incredibly important. I would think of, is it, I'm going to get the co-op wrong. Is it Sulphur Springs Cooperative? There's a cooperative down there, and we hope that they've already been innovative in this area of marketing broadband via microwave. But the Mojave Valley Electric Cooperative leveraged a broadband grant to plan out hard wire along their electric lines. And there's legislation that allows for easements for that purpose. If you already have an electric line running, you might as well just run a broadband line along that same corridor to help build out capacity. So broadband grants will be important for planning and development. But then the I-19 corridor is going to be really, really huge, I think, for Southern Arizona. From that Tucson to Nogales, you're going to have a broadband backbone that you can build off of that will definitely help provide redundancy. You'll allow for more competition to come into that area that could bring down the cost and improve access overall.
Great. Matt, we have a question from our fellow Dan Palm from Northern Arizona University. He's asking about ASRS and its unfunded liabilities. Can you talk about, how the state is, the philosophy behind the trust funds and the dynamics of pension funds and its sustainability into the future? I know that's a large question, so you can narrow it as you see fit.
Sure. What I would say to that, for those of you who might not know, the ASRS is the Arizona State a pension plan for state employees, but also municipal employees, county employees, for teachers. They're all in this. It's a very unusual. A lot of other states have separate pension plans for different employee groups. We're all lumped into one plan. It's the largest plan, and it's actually one of the healthiest plans. It is the healthiest plan for us. Based on fiscal year 2020 data, the funded status was in excess of 70% based on our calculations. That's pretty good. That's actually really, really good compared to similar pension plans across the country. The state's exposure to that is relatively small. State employees represent about 13%. of ASRS. And then the rest is counties, cities, schools. One of the problems that comes along with ASRS, unlike we have three other pension systems. One's called the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System for police and fire. And the other one's called Correctional Officers Retirement Plan. And that's for correctional officers. And then we have another one that's been closed. It's called the Elected Officials Retirement Plan, primarily elected officials and judges. That's been closed since 2014. But the problem with ASRS, as it's kind of this full group, the state could put in money and it has a very small dent in the overall contribution rate for employees. Everyone would have to contribute some money versus the state appropriating it. Well, schools get money from property taxes. They have a lot of priorities, but they're a large member of this. And so the contribution rate makes it, the pool of the system makes it really difficult, put a lot of cash in to lower that liability without all of the participants and the participating institutions throwing in cash. Otherwise, it falls completely to the state, and it's very cost prohibitive to try to do that. Although, 50 million will help, 250 million will help, but we're talking about an unfunded liability in the billions of dollars over 20 plus years. So that's, the ASRS. Now, the PSPRS, you have your own little group. Department of Public Safety has its own retirement plan at PSPRS. And what a lot of states or cities are doing is they're issuing pension obligation bonds. They're issuing debt, get the cash, deposit it into the rainy day or into their retirement plan account. And then the idea is that will earn more. The rate of return of investments in the stock market and other things will be more than the cost of servicing the debt plus the interest. And then you can reduce your unfunded liability, potentially do an arbitrage game here where you can earn more on this than you would otherwise if you had just made your normal contributions. So it's an interesting development that's occurring across the state right now, but it's lowering the contribution rate. So the annual budget impact on cities and towns becomes much less, and they can redirect that to other city services.
Matt, we have a question from Ashley Harrington, who is a individual from Central Arizona well, no, not Central Arizona College, Arizona Western College. Ashley, don't beat me up for that. She has some questions around the funding of community colleges, supporting reskilling, and also technology. So if you could kind of answer that question for her, that would be great.
So for our rural colleges, they're fully funded through the equalization formula. There's a formula based on student count, and so they get operating aid, and they get full funding of the STEM, science, technology, engineering, math formula aid for operating. Whereas Maricopa and Pima, we've suspended that formula for a number of years. The good news is Prop 207, which legalized recreational marijuana, is going to has a very massive amount of money. I want to say it's 33% of sales tax revenues, special tax on the marijuana. 33% of the revenues are going to community colleges for CTE and other workforce programs. Recreational permits are out, our licenses are out and right now, and we estimate that $18 million will flow to the community colleges in 2022, which is a significant amount of money, because you saw that there was some formula changes for rural Arizona. It was about $2 million. Just think about the share of 18 million. I'm going to say it's roughly 10 million. 7 to $10 million will go to rural areas on top of the equalization aid, which will have a huge difference in their programming. And that's only going to grow. 18 million is going to grow over the next several years before we estimate it will flatten out by 2024, 2025. And then it'll be kind of a base line revenue thereafter.
Matt, we have a question from Stuart. It's not directly to the budget, but I think as your experience as a Flinn-Brown Fellow and your work in the community, he's asking if your service as a school board member influenced your conversations and decisions around the state budget, and how your perspective at the local level has influenced your work and your views in state government.
Well, and Don, you've been in a number of conversations with me in education development, and certainly you are one of the great minds of education in Arizona over the last 2 decades, to say the least. I can tell you that I have become a better budget director because of my service on the local level, in the school board room, and understanding how school budgets respond to what the state budget includes. I think oftentimes there's always this traditional gap between the policymakers and the practitioners. It's great in theory, but implementing that policy becomes more challenging, and it may not work out the way you intend it to work out. Not saying that I've figured it all, learning along the way, and but I will tell you that the context and the texture of my service on the school board really did inform a lot of my recommendations and my feedback on proposals throughout the 4 budgets I've helped author.
Matt, our next question is from Samantha Jackson, and her interest is in affordable housing. She's interested in a plan around eviction after moratoriums are lifted, and whether the governor is going to weigh in on the restoration of the housing trust fund or adopting LIHTC.
So right now we're focused on getting the federal aid out. Over $400 million in this latest COVID relief bill is going to be heading to Arizona, whether half of that's going to localities and half of that's going to the state. And it's our top priority to get that funding out to people as quickly as possible. So I think that's the immediate driver here. I think there are larger concerns, though, about housing affordability. Arizona, on one hand, it's great that people want to move here. Are booming. People are coming here to find opportunity. We want to keep it that way. But it's also created a really significant limitation in the housing market, and has driven up prices significantly. And we led the nation in terms of housing price growth, which is a problem from a housing affordability standpoint, as you can imagine. I think part of that is going to be a conversation with localities and how we do zoning, infill properties. That I think is a huge barrier, and I think Arizona is uniquely positioned at time. But it's not too late. You look at San Francisco, I think to a large extent, LA, to New York City, Chicago, these densely populated cities, housing affordability at Seattle is a crisis. And I think it's been driven in large part by very bad zoning policies and allowing developers to develop as they need to in a cost-effective way, and permitting and et cetera can get in the way. The red tape can really drive up the value proposition of, or can lower the value proposition of building. So I think we're uniquely positioned at the beginning of this, before it's too late, to really take a hold of our regulatory posture from a development perspective.
Matt, I think our last question from Frank, a fellow Frank McCune, from the city of Phoenix. As you can imagine, he's very interested in how your tax relief package will impact cities and towns, and whether there will be a safety net in place that holds municipalities and counties harmless from a shared revenue perspective.
So for those of you who don't know, cities and towns get a piece of the tax collections in terms of income tax collections in the form of urban shared revenue. I believe right now it's at 15%. Don't hold me to that, but I think it's somewhere around 15% of income tax revenues the cities and towns get, and it's 2 years after the fact. So our income tax cut would start in 22. Cities and towns would begin to feel that impact or see that impact in 24. Now, I think it's important to consider the dynamic nature of revenue forecasting. We continue to be a growth state in terms of jobs, job recovery, weekly wage growth. Things are booming in Arizona, and you talk to any economist, and absent the uncertainty that comes along with the virus and the vaccine and its response and efficacy and its distribution and getting community spread up, we have a long runway ahead of us. So the concern that cities and towns have on missing out on that tax revenue, I think, will be overridden by just the massive juggernaut of the Arizona economy, and that it's being on fire and really stimulating it in the right way and leading in a recovery. So versus kind of a scarcity mentality, I think we are looking at a growth mentality, and I think the cities and towns are going to end up better in 2024 than they think otherwise.
Well, if they don't, you're going to hear from Frank. So I think that's it, Matt. We are so appreciative of the information. I think that both of us coming out of the budget shops, know that this drives conversation throughout the legislative process, that it is a 100+ day effort. And it's great for our fellows and our community members to have a sense of what they're going to be hearing about in the newspaper. I wanted to share also that this recording and your presentation will be on our website fairly quickly after the conclusion of this webinar. Everyone will get an email with a link, and we thank you. If there's any final words you'd like to make, Matt, please do. Otherwise, thanks very much.
Well, Dawn, thank you again for having this. These are important conversations. These are important questions to be asked, and I just want to salute everyone on the call that sat through the presentation. I think if the takeaway is anything, the budget is more than just about dollars and cents. It's about people's lives, education, healthcare, their welfare, housing, broadband and connectivity. Will they have a job? These are all really important issues that the budget touches every single day. You get on a road, if you drive, you are paying a gasoline tax to support the underground storage tank fund and potentially the water quality assurance revolving fund, which is our Superfund site. And you're driving on roads that we pay through other gasoline taxes that we leverage from the federal government. But the bigger point here is all the people who have those questions. They were people-related questions, because that's really hopefully better in the lives of as many people as possible. So thank you to all who took some time out this afternoon to chat about the budget, to chat about those issues that are of interest to your community, and for flexing your civic muscle, because this is incredibly important. And for those of you who are thinking about Flinn-Brown, this is going to be, this presentation is just a taste of the variety and the thoroughness of getting to know Arizona government, Arizona policy, and Arizona people. So Don, thank you again. Thank you all for tuning in, and feel free, don't be a stranger. Let me know if you have any other questions, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.